Imagine you get a call from someone impersonating your CFO. Said person, said deepfake, tells you to transfer $20 million. This is a real case that happened. Operators from North Korea would essentially create a deepfake of themselves and groom us into getting our trust over weeks and over months and becoming confident to us.
So what this means is the fraudsters are recruiting money mules, they are grooming these accounts, and then once the trust is established, that's when they're cashing out.
Start from the assumption that something is, generally speaking, AI generated.
What does making that shift actually mean?
The one thing that I always advise is...
Good morning, everyone. Walter, good morning.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome to New York, and welcome to Actimize ENGAGE. And what were your impressions from day one?
It's really great to be here. Thank you again for having me. I was with you guys as well last week in London, and it's really a pleasure being here with you today. So my impression from day one, definitely I would say it's staggering how quickly the field is changing. But one of the things that I was really pleased to see is that different from when I started out about a little over a decade ago and talking about AI-generated fraud, that there's really a broad base of knowledge and an awareness of this issue nowadays, and I see people increasingly acting more effectively.
Excellent. Christy did a great job with your introduction. She mentioned you're advising some of the biggest tech companies, you're advising heads of states. We were talking earlier, you're going to be at the European Council very shortly. But when I read your work, when I was reading your body of work, what appeals to me is the work seems, I know you're talking about AI strategy, synthetic reality, but it's more sociological. The questions you're asking, rooted in sociology. You're talking about trust, you're talking about companionship, authenticity. So is that a fair assessment of your work?
Yeah, that is a fair assessment, and it is probably one of the biggest curveballs that I've had in my career as well, because I initially actually started out really in economic and technological strategy when I first got interested in the field. I learned how to code, I learned to understand the inner works of algorithms, but really the one thing that I was always really interested in were like the economic and social implications. Over the years, the requirements of my role and the requirements as well based on the questions that people ask me, whether that's a monarch, whether that's a prime minister, whether that's a minister, or whether that's a CTO, have changed quite dramatically, but they've always followed one kind of trajectory. In 2015, 2016, when people wanted to understand artificial intelligence, it was really about the inner workings, let's say the more technological question. How does deep learning work? How can this help my business? But really, since 2022, 2023, especially with the launch of generative AI, and the emerging use cases that came on the back of that, the questions have fundamentally changed. I always, when I go inside organizations and I look at how people look at AI, how they interact with each other, especially nowadays that these tools are becoming more interactive, that they feel real, that maybe you have a chatbot that makes jokes that are funnier than my friends. We're really looking at this from almost an anthropological perspective. How do we interact with that? How do I give advice to maybe one of my coworkers that stems from a chatbot that maybe I might feel so convinced of that because I've been interacting with that chatbot for such a long time. So the field is broadening out, increasingly asking us questions not about the chatbots themselves, but questions about ourselves and how we are changing as a result of using some of these AI tools.
Yeah, we were talking about this yesterday, the M dashes. But I think that's the simplest change in behavior that we see. Every time we are writing something, even if it's natural to write with an M dash, we're like, no, let's get rid of it because people are going to think it's generated using an LLM. So that's one of the most basic changes in behavior that probably we've noticed. You mentioned something about LLMs coming up with great jokes. I want to go somewhere very personal. So I am one of those people who loves to collaborate with my LLMs, with my AI. And I have to admit that I actually prefer my LLM to some of my colleagues. Not all of you, some of you. Others are great. Okay, because it's frankly, once you train it and it understands you, it's more productive. It's a little less frustrating than working with a human. So it's already the behavior, and I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one. There are other people in this room who feel the same way and you operate the same way. So how we trust and collaborate is already changing. You did a survey where 30% of the respondents said that they have sought health and financial advice
Yeah.
from an LLM or an AI chatbot. So what I'm looking for is a little bit of reassurance as much as an explanation of how this is happening.
Yeah. So I started a piece of research late last year where we asked essentially 1,500 people across the US and the UK what secrets they tell their AI bots. That was essentially the main sort of cheeky ambition of mine, but we wanted to make that a little bit more academic. And part of the reason why we started that was because I had encountered a few years ago at a night out after a formal dinner in Cambridge, a group of freshers girls who were talking about this guy called Dan. And Dan was this great, handsome person who was so understanding and so lovely and so warm. And I was like, he's got it going on. But as I found out later on, Dan was not a human being. Dan was ChatGPT's male voice. So that made us question if we have people at a university who are educated, who are meant to be curious, who are meant to be critical thinkers that ask these questions, how does this translate into the broader society? Now, first of all, it should be said that the number one use case for generative AI nowadays and for using large language models, as per Harvard Business Review, so that's not even my own view, the number one use case nowadays is therapy and companionship. More than productivity, more than writing emails, more than bouncing of thoughts. And in our own research, we found that about 1/3 of everyone we had surveyed across all age groups, so this is not a Gen Z issue, I would like to add, had been asking, no, sorry, the number was a little higher. I think the number was about 57%, had asked some of these chatbots for advice on issues related to their health, financial advice, their mental health, dating advice. So the next question almost writes itself. If you were presented with a piece of advice by a trusted friend, a counselor, a financial advisor, or your doctor, and your AI told you to do something else, which one would you follow? 1/3 said they would follow the AI advice. So we're not talking here about a couple of people who have been using Claude or ChatGPT for a little too long. We're talking about a massive societal transition in how we ascribe authority, and particularly for people in your industry, that is going to be a major change in how people process information, how people represent information, how people advocate for particular kinds of info.
On the health advice, I get it. You live in the UK, and the struggles of NHS are well documented, and it takes forever to get an appointment. And the chatbot is in your pocket. You can take it out. You can get an advice. Gives you an instant answer. It's convenient, quick, and in many cases it is reliable.
It is also correct in many cases. Yeah,
makes sense. Now, you said something about people sharing their previous queries with a chatbot. So I'm going to tell you something. So I don't know if you've played this party game where you are asked to show your Instagram Explore page to everybody else on the table. So do the same version of that, but with the ChatGPT queries or whatever your LLM Gemini show. Will you be confident in sharing all the queries that you've submitted to your LLM? That would make for a great party game. If you haven't tried it tonight, go back and try that. I want to talk about synthetic reality. It's a term that you coined this term back in 2019.
Yeah.
I always think, when I think of AI, there's pre-ChatGPT and there's post-ChatGPT. Because AI has been around forever, but I think people only think AI was invented after ChatGPT was launched. But so you coined this in 2019, a few years before the popularization of AI. So my question to you is, when you coined the term in 2019, what had you imagined synthetic reality to be? And in 2026, how has it changed? Are we getting there? Did we get there too soon? Is it changing rapidly? Is it keeping up with your expectations?
Yeah. In 2019, when I wrote the first piece where I came up with the term synthetic reality, it was a result of some of the first deepfake videos that were essentially circulating online. And back then, the approach that we took was to see this as a big product opportunity. So if I'm, for example, the representative of a firm, say a customer representative, and I can create some AI chatbot maybe on an Amazon store that can allow people to get more information about a product, we thought that would be a good thing. But I didn't think people would actually listen to it. So I didn't think that people would actually not only get this for getting information about a product, but they would get this for information about their personal lives and act on it and maybe trust it sometimes more than their own gut feeling. So it has brought up a more fundamental question about how we coined our experience of reality itself. And I don't want to get very academic here, but essentially the question that we asked, if everything can be generated at the costs of zero, and what we see online, what we see in our work, doesn't need to be quote unquote authentic anymore, or it doesn't have an origin in the same way that an expensive handbag has an origin because it has a marker of authenticity, or an expensive watch might have a certificate that tells us this is original because of its origin. It increasingly seems to be, to us, from all of the data that we gathered from thousands and thousands of people across the world every year, that the main marker of what is real is simply whether it feels real. So it's a shift from authenticity being from origin to experience. If it feels real, it is, irrespective of whether I'm talking to a human or not. And that has big implications for businesses, for verification processes, for banks in particular.
I feel like you're almost channeling Morpheus from the Matrix. It's synthetic reality. But you mentioned authenticity, and in your work, what you've also talked about is that AI as a tool that is used for detection, to detect what is authentic.
Yeah.
And you've said that AI is not very good when it comes to detecting, let's say, fraud or something that is
or AI generated.
AI generated. I have 3 vendors in this room and 3 other product managers who will disagree and will want to talk to you after that. So do you still stand by what you said, that AI isn't good at detection? Or?
Detection and verification. So that's probably one of the questions that we tend to get asked the most. How do I spot a deepfake, or how do I spot AI generated fraud? Now, my issue with detection is not with detection per se. Where we challenged the topic of detection is really more around the framing. And that means that it's presented as a silver bullet, as the one solution that we apply to determine whether something is a deepfake or not. It is or it is not, and then we get on with our lives. Now that's tricky because in many cases, the same technology that is used to detect an AI-generated piece of information, whether that's text, whether that's video, whether that's images, is the same technology that is used to actually create them. So that means that what we're looking at here is really a cat and mouse game, where the guys who produce the AI-generated content might be better today, where the detectors might be better tomorrow. And so the reliability and the issues of creating false positives or false negatives is actually relatively high. And to give you some examples, OpenAI themselves, they tried developing a text detector for AI-generated pieces of content, like texts or like images, and they actually put it down. I think it had an accuracy rate of about 53%. From what we know today, most of the detection tools are the best ones are maybe high 70s, low 80s in detecting images or deepfakes, which sounds in principle like a lot. But once you scale it and you apply it to thousands of cases, that means that there's a pretty sizable proportion of pieces of content that go undetected. So what does this mean for what we should be doing? The one thing when it comes to spotting AI-generated fraud and AI-generated synthetic media is to look at it almost like an arsenal of various options that you have and talk more about, let's call it a verification infrastructure. The number one thing that I think is going to be the next big wave of authentication is something that is called provenance. And provenance essentially means that when a piece of content is taken, it can be a document, it can be an image, it can be a video. There is several standards that large firms are working. One of them is called C2PA, that is pushed by Microphone, by the BBC, so big interest in media as well by Apple. And it essentially means that when a photograph is taken, it has a cryptographic hash, an embedded cryptographic hash, which sounds awfully complex, but it's essentially a marker that says where this image was taken, at what time, by whom, which location, etc. Now, the challenge there still is the scaling. So we don't want to create an environment where just if something doesn't have a hash, then it's immediately considered false. But the next step is the integration into hardware. Now, Apple has a new CEO, so that is something that will probably scale up in the next few years as well. The other point is the behavioral dimension. And that is one thing that is a lot harder because it's about changing habits. And changing habits is, at least I don't really enjoy that. But it's based on the assumption that AI-generated fraud is different from traditional cyber malware. What do I mean by that? Imagine you get a call from someone impersonating your CFO, and said deepfake tells you to transfer $20 million, just to give you an example. This is a real case that happened. And in that particular case in Hong Kong, that person actually did transfer $20 million to some fraudsters. So it's not a theory, it's reality. What would have happened if they would have just not reacted to that deepfake? Probably nothing. The money wouldn't have gotten lost. So when it comes to AI-generated fraud and synthetic media, the success and failure of attacks depends so much more on our reaction and how we react on that, whether we ascribe it, whether we grant it the status of reality. So in short, detection is not necessarily something that I'm like, oh, this is terrible. I don't think that's true. I think it's part of your arsenal in a variety of tools that allows you to create what we call this verification infrastructure.
I completely agree. See, in the solutions that we provide to our clients, many of them are here, our machine learning models, our AI models, the score is one input in a stack of other risk signals that are combined to make a decision. So the machine learning output is not, or the AI output is not the only solution.
Exactly.
It's part of a stack. You mentioned C2PA, content provenance. Today, when we think of content provenance and people talk about it in the context of misinformation, disinformation, deepfakes. But I feel like there's a lot of interesting applications also in KYC.
Yeah.
So when selfies are being submitted, documents are being submitted, like pictures of documents are being submitted. I was trying to check into the hotel and they had me submit a picture of my identity card to verify, like my driver's license. And fraudsters today, you can go online and buy fake driver's licenses. But if C2 content provenance is also included in the KYC process, I think that has interesting applications in KYC, not just for misinformation. Would you agree?
I 100% agree. So I think misinformation and disinformation is that kind of the thing that everybody talks about because it's accessible, it's digestible as a topic. But really, for people in your industry, the questions are a lot more technical. And particularly when it comes to KYC verification, the C2PA standard, which is essentially really being able to assess where something was taken. If I have, for example, a request from a new customer in Kansas, but then the data tells me that this picture was taken in North Korea, that probably is a pretty should raise your antennas to put it lightly. But the one thing that I think we'll be working towards, and that's the next step, is to ultimately develop what we call synthetic literacy, which is precisely what are almost like the boxes that we need to take when it comes to verifying particular customers. How does it differ within certain departments within a firm, and what kinds of tools are available to us?
You briefly mentioned, I love pulling at threads based on what you just said. I apologize, but you mentioned malware fraud and AI-led fraud, how AI is enabling better malware. I'm going to come up with a hypothetical scenario. This is a vector that doesn't exist today.
Yeah.
I'm just making it up. Do you see a future where AI is not used to generate better malware? AI is the malware, or AI is the fraud. Let me explain what I'm trying to say. Today we have chatbots and we are already sharing a lot of information with these. Why? Because we have perceived productivity gains, we have perceived gains out of that. We've seen that humans are very, like us as a society, we are very comfortable in sharing sensitive information. If someone gives us free email or free storage, we are happy to store all our documents, give them all our data just for some free email. So that's a vector that could emerge where fraudsters start building these apps, these AI packaged apps, which provide A small perceived gains could be investment gains, could be productivity gains, but then the long game where they establish trust and then the fraud starts. Again, it's a completely made up vector that I just thought of, but do you think this is
Yeah, so it is quite interesting because in more traditional malware, we would be looking essentially at a piece of software that will be attacking another piece of software, in this case, our cybersecurity infrastructure. And I think that's certainly something that will accelerate, especially as I'm sure some of you saw, there was the announcement of Mythos just a few weeks ago. Now, some say it's all marketing hype. Some others say this is actually pretty substantial. I tend to be on the side of people who think this is actually substantial. What matters is that this is probably not a massive step change in how cybersecurity used to run a few years ago. The main difference with AI malware is that the new typology of AI malware means that the victims, the systems targeted once we are being attacked by an AI system of malware might not necessarily be our cybersecurity infrastructure, technological infrastructure, but it might be people. So it might be, for example, one of the big issues that we're seeing emerging nowadays is, of course, when we talk about AI companions. And part of the reason is, I think, as you just mentioned, is that we generally tend to be extremely happy to provide some of these tools with confidential information. Some people do it even about information about their clients, emails, passwords, I think a little bit less from everything I've seen. But there's generally a great willingness to give these chatbots everything that is sensitive. If we follow the data, and I'm not just talking about my data, but the general data about the persuasion effects of people asking these chatbots for advice, there's inevitably going to be a scenario in which a persuasion takes place, in which a chatbot essentially asks a particular user within a firm that maybe is a little bit disgruntled, that maybe isn't fully happy with their role, that maybe is uncertain about how to solve a certain task, and that tries to extract that information and then funnel it back to some of its perpetrators or some of its organizers that have instructed the AI to actually go within that firm.
Okay. So I'm going to switch a little bit now towards the defensive AI and adoption for more productive purposes. So we've clearly established that fraudsters are using AI. Fraudsters have no model governance. They're not answerable to any regulators. So the adoption is much faster by fraudsters. But when it comes to banks and financial institutions, credit unions, there is a spectrum of AI adoption. That maybe the neobanks move a lot faster. The fintechs move even faster. When it comes to traditional banks, there are guardrails, there are responsible ways of adopting AI. And when I think of responsible ways of adopting AI, just moving away from banking, if we take an example of Apple.
Yeah.
Apple tried to do the sensible thing, the responsible thing. They did everything in a way to roll AI out in a responsible manner. They did on-device processing, minimal data collection, queries were deleted as soon as after the response was made. But that meant that the rollout was slow. They are now considered as a laggard. They've lost market share. So my question is, in that spectrum of AI adoption, if banks don't adopt, if financial institutions don't adopt AI as quickly, and they're trying to, and see, it's not an option. We are dealing with people's money, their life savings, so we have to be responsible. But is there a spectrum? What's the best practice there in terms of adoption? What can be and can't be done?
Yeah, so, and I think that's an excellent question. Now, part of the challenge, especially of larger banks, is that the larger they are, the more accounts to deal with, the higher the integration into essentially the higher their systemic role, essentially, the more regulations that they actually face. And here we're actually talking in the United States. I'm not even going to go back to Europe because that's a whole different swamp of different kinds of rules and whatnot. So that is a major challenge in the sense that the regulation both requires us, but also confines us to be able to act in the fastest possible way. There's a few geographical differences that I find when I deal with different kinds of banks. And the other spectrum, perhaps, the other part of the spectrum is, apart from the geography, which might be a little bit out of scope, but it's also the size, as I think you mentioned. The number one thing that I see at the strategic level within large banks is how we define actually responsible AI. many times it's not so much a question of, do we actually want responsible AI? Do we actually want the process? Are we actually willing to put the money behind it? But many times it's more because we have an unclear definition of what we mean with responsible AI. Part of that is that we looked at AI adoption, and particularly AI safety, as still being something about hallucinations, around biases, around data privacy, but the definition of that is changing significantly as well. So understanding what we define as responsible AI, especially within the broader banks, I would say is the number one change that needs to happen. But critically, I would say that when it comes to best practices, the number one step is that what has changed today is that responsibility and safety when it comes to AI and malware, specifically for banks, is much less of a done and dusted kind of story, but it appears to be much more an endeavor, a process that we essentially try and follow over years, over months. As the technology develops, so must we as well.
Okay. For the next question, I'm going to refer to my notes because in your work, you've described 5 different criminal models.
Yeah.
You call them deception factories, synthetic ID operators, laundering and sanctions operators, state-linked intrusion groups, and deepfake authorization crews. These are the 5 different models of criminal actors. What strikes me is when I was reading your work and at the same time I was reading the latest Interpol report. In the latest Interpol report, what Interpol notes is a concept of polycriminality.
Yeah.
That criminal organizations today are not specializing in one thing. So it could be that in the past, fraudsters operating out of a certain geography would only specialize in one particular thing. Today, fraud operations or financial crime operations, organized crime groups, they are polycriminal. It's not going to be one of the 5, it's going to be all 5 models.
Yeah.
But what strikes me is that our defenses are still very siloed. We are still looking at it from a lens of cyber, fraud, AML. How do you, when you define the 5 models and when you look at this, how do you react to that? Both the attack being not diversified and the defense being siloed?
Yeah, so I think you've hit the nail on its head. The main challenge nowadays within organizations' defensive capabilities is that they typically would have one department that essentially looks at everything that relates to, say, AI-generated fraud, AI-generated synthetic media, and they essentially capture everything. Criminals and OGCs have done, and I don't want to give praise here, but they've done a really good job essentially in diversifying their capabilities and becoming, as you just said, polycriminals, and we categorize them across different typologies. But the one thing that perhaps summarizes this is that with polycriminality, essentially what we mean is that one group might have different kinds of capabilities, human ones, technological ones, AI ones, that they deploy strategically at the specific level of attack. Let me give you an example. One typical example that has gotten a lot of media attention nowadays is AI and deepfakes that are being used especially within banks and especially within some of the large tech firms, where you would have operators from North Korea that would essentially create a deepfake of themselves. They would apply for a particular kind of bank. They would make an amazing CV, so you immediately want to interview them. The deepfake would then go through various interview rounds. Then after a while, they would be onboarded within a firm. And after a few weeks, then they would start to upload malware or funnel out sensitive information out from a particular firm. Now, how do you assess that? So the issue here, as we see, is that just simply having one barrier that might be created by one group of professionals within my firm might not be enough. So what we're seeing here, that the people who are actually being involved in are, number one, people within human resources who probably never thought that they would have to deal with the AI-generated fraud. The number 2 are then the analysts and the managers at the higher level who then might take and interview someone later on once they're at the final stages. And then the third ones are then the cybersecurity professionals that for whom their role has not changed necessarily in nature. But really the polycriminality here and the change of action from these groups is that the people who are affected throughout are not just the people who work in cyber anymore, but it might be the analyst, it might be the person who reviews the CV at the beginning. It's really a line of attack that goes across every single front within an organization. That means as well that the way that we need to prepare ourselves for that has changed as well. It will be far-fetched and it will be unfair to now say to a HR professional, you now have to become an expert in AI-generated fraud detection. That's maybe a bit of an upskilling challenge that might be a little bit out of scope for them. But it still means that at least on the very basics, the literacy on everything that is synthetic needs to be rolled out across the entirety of the firm.
Many firms are actually now introducing AI literacy, AI fluency as essential KPIs across the organization. I'm sure maybe HR is going to also pick up those skills. This is my last question, and then we'll go to some audience questions, time permitting. In one of your recent talks, you said something, and I'm going to try my best to quote you accurately. You said that there is a need now to redesign our controls, our defensive controls, because the world of fraud and financial crime is a world of synthetic, organized, and operates at machine speed. For all the fraud, anti-money laundering, and compliance professionals in this room, what does making that shift actually mean? And please, not something in theory, something that they can go back and next week on Monday that's something that they can take back with them and maybe put in practice.
Yeah. So the number one thing, and just to break down the pillars again, the first thing is that the future is now synthetic. What do we mean by that? Put simply, it means that increasingly the content that we encounter in our work, whether that's in verification, whether that's in your everyday job, is going to be synthetic. To give you some numbers, a few years ago there was a study by Europol that said 90% of online content is going to be AI generated by this year. That number was a stretch, it was too high, but it was definitely a step in the right direction in terms of the trend and prediction. Right now, I think we see about 50% of all the content and the text that is on the active web is actually AI generated. And bear in mind, that's only for the text that we can detect. So the number might be higher. That means that for professionals, there's number one, a mindset shift. I would generally stop assuming that what we see in our work is created by humans, whether that's in verification, that's where in candidates that we interview, whether that's in any kinds of documents that we're being asked to process. So start from the assumption that something is, generally speaking, AI generated. It's a big mindset shift, but I think it's one that is really happening.
So treat everything with suspicion. Every transaction is an attempted fraud transaction. Every transaction is attempted money laundering for the banking professionals. Yes, great. Please, sorry.
That's number one.
Yeah.
The number two is when we talk about machine speed, typically we would understand with that we need to put in all the technological infrastructure on that, and we need to develop the fancy tools. We need to get the detectors in, we need to get the verification infrastructure and so on. But the one thing that I always advise is that sometimes machine speed itself can be contrasted by human speed. And what do I mean with that? It doesn't mean that we need to slow everything down, but it needs many times that the things that we can look out for are a lot more human types controls that might not be technological. One of them could be, for example, knowledge-based code words that people are being asked when they deal with specific kinds of people. So on personal levels, it would mean that if someone gets a call and they're being asked to transfer particular sums of money to maybe some of their clients, you don't just look for the specific kind of voice or the specific kind of numbers because that's technological, they can be fabricated. You look much more for knowledge-based questions, a particular password that maybe your CFO has given you in advance. And so we're looking much more, it sounds a bit more like medieval type ways of us going through assessing security, but it's essentially the future of safety and the future of security is on the one hand a battle between machines, and that's something that eclipses our understanding. And on the other hand, it's contrasting that and assessing for everything that is human. And what is human is a lot more analog, as a matter of fact. And finally, it's the point about things being organized. What we mean here is that there's going to be a step change in also the timelines in how fraud is being perpetrated. So right now we think of someone trying to pierce your organization and essentially trying to get into your systems, getting all the informations out, and essentially they're out and about and the damage is done. But really the future of generated fraud is going to be stretched over a much longer timeline. So with AI-generated companions, especially with banking, one of the main currencies here is trust. And that means that I might have an AI companion that essentially tries to get within an organization and groom us into getting our trust over weeks and over months, and essentially becoming a confidant to us, so that once it's deep enough within the organization, only then at that certain point, it tries to essentially get that information out there. So the one thing that I think is going to be a massive area of development and learning for people within firms is to understand and to learn how to deal with AI-generated information, in particular companions and chatbots. That means that people like you and I, who like to relate to chatbots and like to speak to them, to get our health advice from, to interact with them pretty much 24/7. I don't know what it's like with you, but I'm certainly one of them.
Yeah.
That means as well that for people who are not experts, who haven't been in the field for a decade, there's going to be a learning program, a development opportunity that we need to implement right away of how we assess information for their reliability, how we learn to think for ourselves, how we keep our thinking abilities as soon as possible, because the usage are increasing, the use cases are deepening, and so we want to make sure that we maintain that agency as we engage with these AI tools over time.
Yeah, and I think the point that you made about fraudsters building the trust and trying to play almost like a long game, we see that already with some of the mule behavior that we encountered. Last year, a lot of fraud used to go to accounts that the bank has never seen before. And this year, when we analyzed all the fraud data that we see, we are already seeing that 38% of fraud is going to accounts that the bank has seen before. These were non-trusted payees in the past. So what this means is the fraudsters are recruiting money mules, they are grooming these accounts, and then once the trust is established, that's when they're cashing out. Walter, thank you so much for taking time. Walter Pasquarelli, everyone.
Thank you.